Hey, everybody. My guest today is Professor David Smith, and we're going to talk about dehumanization. All right, Professor, why don't you introduce yourself?
My name is David Livingstone Smith. I always include the Livingston because there's so many David Smiths in the world. And I'm a professor of philosophy at the University of New England in southern Maine.
Wonderful. So you wrote a book on dehumanization, and I want to learn more about it because I think it's an interesting topic.
Mhm.
So as a first question, why don't we start with what is dehumanization?
Okay, well, first of all, I've written three books on dehumanization. And over time, the first one was published in 2011. My views have become refined on this matter. So I understand dehumanization in the following way. When we dehumanize others, we conceive of them as subhuman creatures.
Okay. Yeah, and I think that makes sense. I think when I think of examples of dehumanization, I think of Nazi Germany. I think of racism, right? Seeing this other group as somehow less than human.
Uh-huh.
Of course, that the person who's doing the dehumanization sees themselves as human and
Yep.
therefore better and more
Mhm.
morally worthy or having more moral worth, right?
Yeah, I mean, that works kind of like racialization does, that the person who racializes others in order to demean and denigrate them thereby elevates themselves. So the dehumanizer is always the paradigm of the human. Those that are dehumanized are seen as basically counterfeit human beings, that they're of less intrinsic value than a human being would be.
So do you think that racism is inherently dehumanizing?
Racism paves the way for dehumanization. So I do distinguish racism from dehumanization, but very, very often, not always, it depends on the type of dehumanization we're considering, but very, very often, racism is a precursor to dehumanization. So the way I put it in my 2020 book on inhumanity, dehumanization is racism on steroids. So if I can go on about this a little bit, in my view, racism is not detachable from the notion of race itself. That is, when we racially categorize people, we place them in a hierarchy. And that's part of the function of racialization, right? It legitimates the exploitation, oppression, extermination of people that we find convenient to oppress and demean and exterminate. But racism, simpliciter, sort of lowers the other on the scale of the humans. So they are not less than human, but rather lesser humans. Dehumanization takes that further. Well, they're less than human. They're demoted from the category of the human altogether.
I see. So in your view, then, there is a spectrum of humanness, right? And then there is just a separate category of subhuman. And dehumanization is just in the subcategory of us. I guess that dehumanization is in the category of subhuman and not necessarily on the spectrum of humanness.
Yeah, yes. Provided we interpret spectrum as a sort of a hierarchy of higher and lower human beings. I don't think humanness comes in degrees. I don't think that's how we think about humanness. So when we think about humanness, someone is either human or they're not human. It's digital, as it were. It's not analog. One can regard others as lesser humans, as humans of less intrinsic value, as humans whose lives don't matter as much as our lives do, and irrespective of who we consider ourselves to be, without dehumanizing. So I treat dehumanization as a very particular, very fine-grained notion that's distinct from ordinary garden variety racism. It's distinct from ableism. It's distinct from xenophobia. It's distinct from misogyny. It's a phenomenon all its own.
Okay, so one of the things that comes to mind is when, let's say, two political parties disagree over a variety of issues, and it gets to the point where they don't really talk to each other anymore. And then it results in some sort of dynamic where one side calls the other Nazis, right?
Yeah.
And the other side calls the first side some other type of name.
Yes.
Now, that doesn't seem to be like dehumanization, but it does sound like something very similar, right? Because a Nazi
So,
is still a human being.
well, yes, maybe and maybe not. So here's the thing. It's no longer in most circles socially acceptable to uh, describe others as vermin or as beasts or as monsters or as demons. That all that was once socially acceptable in the United States, but it's not now. So terms like Nazis, sometimes the term Nazi is used as to demonize, right? So you say someone is demonic or monstrous without saying it. So sometimes when those accusations are leveled, it is sort of closeted dehumanization. I might put it that way. At other times, it isn't. Context is very, very important, and to clearly distinguish when, in many cases, when dehumanization is occurring from when it's not occurring is often very difficult, right? We have to take a bunch of things into consideration in order to make a call, and even there, it's often uncertain. Obviously, in cases where, and there are many of such cases in the past and still today, where a group of people is described quite explicitly as subhuman, then we really don't have that difficulty to the same degree.
Yeah. So let's take white supremacy as an example,
Yeah.
as it's just one of the first ones that comes to mind. Now, I don't really know that much about white supremacy. I probably just have a average person's understanding of it,
Well,
But it seems to me that there has to be some sort of mental gymnastics that's involved in it, right? So, for instance, I hear that a lot of white supremacists will base their supremacy off of like IQ. Okay.
yeah,
But
yeah.
then what if they're confronted
Allegedly.
with another group that has a higher IQ? It's like, oh, well,
Yeah.
Ashkenazi Jews maybe have a higher IQ than the average white
Yeah.
person. And then maybe their response will be, oh, well, they're morally corrupt. They're
Yes,
morally
yes,
inferior.
yes. So here's the really important distinction going on with white supremacy and similar racializing efforts. The racialized person and the dehumanized person are seen as having less intrinsic value. In other words, if in themselves, they don't matter as much as we do. That's perfectly compatible with seeing them as having abilities that exceed those attributed to us. So, in fact, it's typical, and this is very important. So, speaking as an Ashkenazi Jew, Nazis saw Jewish people, and they were particularly concerned with Ashkenazi Jews because of the geography involved in the Nazi movement, as intellectually superior, demonically intelligent, but intrinsically inferior. Similarly, white supremacists often see people of African descent as having kind of superhuman capacities, athleticism, prodigious sexual appetites, insensitivity to pain, and things like this. So it's not. See, the notion of inferiority involved isn't global. It's very, very particular.
So this is interesting, right? Because normally we would attach maybe the value to something that is valuable, right?
Yeah,
So since we value intelligence, you would think that our valuing of a particular being
yeah,
would correlate with how much the
yeah,
intelligence that they have, right? So
yeah.
what is doing this work? Like, what is this mental gymnastics going on? Like, why would they say that this other particular group is inferior if they possess these qualities that we normally think are good, and they possess it to a greater extent?
Yeah. Well, dehumanization is motivated, right? It's not like, some people wake up one day and say, "Oh, those people, they're different. They must be subhuman." Not at all. In fact, on my account, we're exquisitely sensitive to the humanness of one another. And the reason for that is that we are an ultra social species. The sight of a human face just turns on the perception of human just right away, and that's automatic, and it can't be stopped. Dehumanization has the function of legitimating oppression of various sorts, right? So it doesn't arise spontaneously. It has to be inculcated, right? And this is basically through propaganda, very broadly conceived. What has to happen, at least in the kind of dehumanization that's pertinent to white supremacism, and as I said, there are different kinds of dehumanization, and the kind of dehumanization that's pertinent to white supremacism, I call demonizing dehumanization, involves the idea that these dehumanized others are not only less than human, but they are extremely formidable. They are dangerous. They are monstrous. They pose an existential threat to us, whoever us is, right? So the attribution of superior capacities to them is part of the representation of their dangerousness and formidability.
Yeah, okay, that makes sense, right? That the fact that they're more intelligent than we are makes them more of a
Makes them
threat.
really scary.
The fact that they're stronger than us makes them more of a threat, right? Because if they were super weak, then we wouldn't be scared of them. I see. Interesting. So that relates to the other question that I wanted to ask you, which is kind of like the chicken or the egg type of problem, right? So you were saying, dehumanization is used to justify oppression, legitimize oppression,
Yeah.
right? And I was thinking whether it was that way around or the other way around, right? Which is that because we see certain people as dehumanizing, we think it's appropriate to treat them a particular way.
It's
It's not that we start with the desire to treat them in a particular way and then retroactively justify it.
right. So first of all, let me dispel what might be a misconception. I don't think dehumanization is some sort of deliberate strategy, except sometimes on the part of cynical propagandists who have an investment in the rest of us doing terrible things to other people. Dehumanization is something that happens to us, and that it happens by inputs from propagandists playing on our psychological dispositions. Dehumanization, if you actually look at the history of dehumanization, what you find is plausibly it is always motivated. So, let's consider, you've named the two paradigmatic examples that I use in my work, right? White supremacism in the United States and the Holocaust, and European anti-Semitism more generally. In both cases, we find racialization. So Jews in Europe are the paradigmatic racialized group. African Americans now in the United States are the paradigmatic racialized group, although historically it has not been that clear cut. In both of these instances, there was something to be gained by harming members of this group. So let's stick with the United States example and African Americans. The dehumanization of African Americans was typically post-slavery. During slavery itself, African Americans were, not universally, but largely seen by their Euro-American oppressors as humans of an inferior sort, humans that really needed to be taken into hand, and even for reasons of their health had to be made to work hard. This is an idea that actually goes back to Aristotle, right? And not with reference to Black people, but for Aristotle, there were like Greek men and there was everyone else. And the non-Greek men were people that he considered to be what he called natural slaves. That is, these are people with defects in rationality, and they could only benefit by being enslaved by their superior, superiorly rationally Greek overlords. So you're doing them a favor, basically, by enslaving them. This idea was incorporated into European colonialism and American slavery. So once slavery gets really established in North America, enslaved people are very often not seen as subhuman, just inferior human beings that need to be taken into hand, and And thank God we rescued them from Africa and so on and so forth, all these justifications. After the abolition, or the ostensible abolition of slavery, because slavery didn't really end in 1865, we know it continued much, much later, even into the 20th century. African Americans were ostensibly freed, and they had to be then brought back into line. And what happened then was a lot of explicitly dehumanizing rhetoric, particularly directed at Black males. In fact, the most toxic forms of dehumanization, the sort of the kind that leads to exterminationism, to genocide, tends to selectively target males. So post-Civil War then, and post the collapse of Reconstruction in the United States, you get this upsurge of explicitly dehumanizing rhetoric. You know, Black males are beasts, they're monsters, they're embodiments of a sort of primitive evil. They pose a tremendous danger. And what comes along with that, in addition to efforts to re-enslave Black people, is the epidemic of lynching. One of my practices when I'm writing about this is I go back to the newspaper reports of these really grotesque lynchings. Most Americans have no idea what went on in lynching because the movie versions, the TV versions are so cleaned up. They have to be because lynching was so horrific. It involved bodily mutilation, torture for hours, people being burned alive. Now, if you look at the newspaper reports, and the media were on hand, these were public events, sometimes attended by 10,000 spectators or more. What you find that is that the victim is described again and again and again and again as a beast, as an ape in human form, as a monster. So these dehumanizing characterizations of African Americans, and again, particularly African American males, are there in the service of oppression. So without the motive of oppression, this stuff wouldn't happen, because we're all well aware, irrespective of differences in appearance, we are all well aware, that we are fellow human beings. So what's interesting there then is what happens, like what makes that possible, given our responsiveness to the humanness of others. And that I think comes from an essential feature of human culture, which is that we have people placed in the positions of epistemic authority. As I like to call it, people who are supposed to know. And human culture thrives on sort of epistemic deference to these people. So, I have some kind of pain. I go to my doctor. My doctor tells me what it is. It's not something I can detect, but I have to trust the doctor. The doctor is someone who's supposed to know. When the physicist tells me the chair I'm sitting on is mostly empty space, well, it doesn't look like it, but I trust the physicist because the physicist is supposed to know. Well, that's fine, and that's rational to defer in that way. But what if the experts are race scientists or Joseph Goebbels or some insane, crazy religious leader who, like in Myanmar, the radical Buddhist monks who said the Rohingya are reincarnations of snakes and scorpions. Well, if they're placed in the role of experts, it's rational to trust them. And I think that's what happens in dehumanization.
Interesting. Okay. I never thought about like this deference to experts. So there seems to me that there has to be some other element of why that's even important to people in the first place, right? Like, yeah. I'm only going to go see the dentist because, maybe my tooth hurts. But if my teeth are fine, then I don't care about what the dentist says, necessarily, right? So I feel like there has to be this fundamental desire to attack, harm, or oppress another group in order for you to even care about what the,
I totally agree. Yeah.
So what is that thing?
Well, we can look at it in two ways. Actually, I guess there's one characterization that could unite these two ways. And that is that it has to be the case that we see it as somehow advantageous to us to harm others. Now, that might be because these others are presented as dangerous, as an existential threat. If we look at genocide, we see this again and again and again and again. The genocidaires see themselves as saving the world from evil, as protecting themselves, as stamping out these monsters. And of course, when you're dealing with monsters, there's no mercy involved. They're embodiments of evil. So, any genocide you could name over the last, 200 years, you find this attitude, and genocides are normally racialized, right? The group that is the victim is a racialized group. Of course, to see that, you have to understand the notion of race properly. And I devote a lot of attention to setting out what I think the notion of race involves. So fear. Now, I spend a lot of time in my writings talking about how propaganda works, particularly a certain sort of authoritarian propaganda. And the basic mechanism is to inculcate fear and offer salvation. So these others are a danger. They're poised to destroy us, and only I am suited to deal with them. And we find this again and again and again and again and again. So there's this promise of salvation. Join the Nazi party, or join the MAGA movement, or whatever, and we'll all be saved. And salvation is a very, very powerful promise. So that's one part, and I could go off into that very easily because I spent a lot of time in it and draw on some interesting resources. The other is benefit. So if we look at the origins of white supremacism, at least in the relatively modern era, it was economically just incredibly productive to enslave Africans. I mean, wealth poured into Europe. The fancy houses in Downton Abbey, that comes from money that was acquired on the slave plantations of the Caribbean. But this wasn't straightforward for Europeans, because at the time, we're talking about the 17th century, it was uncertain whether it was morally legitimate certainly to enslave Christians. And a number of the enslaved were Christians. That motivated depriving enslaved people of baptism and admission to the church. What justification could one have for depriving people? If you're a Christian, right, it's a missionary religion. You're supposed to be bringing people into the fold. Well, here's one, and we know this from testimony from the 17th century. Well, they don't have souls. Now, given the possession of a soul was supposed to be the mark of the human, what that amounts to, in fact, they're subhuman creatures. You can't baptize Africans any more than you can baptize cattle or pigs, right? So there was an incentive for thinking this way. It was attractive to think this way. It's not like people sat there and said, well, hey, if I deny that they're human beings, then I let myself off the hook. That would be an impossible strategy. That's like playing chess against yourself, right? You know the moves that your opponent is going to make because they're you, right? There has to be a kind of process of unreflective self-deception involved. Not for everyone. We can perfectly admit there are people who are cynically putting this stuff out because they realized how advantageous it was. But for the run-of-the-mill person, it's very important not to underestimate the degree to which transatlantic slavery, and trans-Sahara slavery for that matter, but I know much more about transatlantic slavery, was profitable. It was not just the plantation owners, it was the shipbuilders and the insurers and the people, the iron workers who manufactured manacles. I mean, it was a rising tide elevates all ships, right? So many people benefited. And when you benefit from something, there are incentives to believe things that justify the benefits accrued to you.
No, that makes sense. Now, this discussion kind of reminds me of certain discussions I've had with people over being vegetarian and eating meat. right? Because it's
Mhm.
like, well, we like how meat tastes, and so we're incentivized to think that it's morally okay. So
Sure.
there's this whole
Yeah.
rationalization process. It's like, oh
Yeah.
well, it's okay to slaughter these animals because they're not as intrinsically valuable. Maybe they're not even intrinsically
Right.
valuable at all, right?
Right.
Because of
Mhm.
they lack certain capacities or this capacity, that capacity.
Yes. Yeah. And that, by the way, is very, very important for understanding dehumanization, what you just said, because one of the two main psychological components that makes it possible for us to dehumanize other is this notion that the world of living things is arranged on a hierarchy. There are higher and lower beings. And we modestly, of course, have always placed ourselves very high. Historically, this is often called the great chain of being, where, there were all these diagrams in the Middle Ages illustrating it with God at the top. God is supremely perfect, right? And then the archangels and the angels, and then we are just below the angels. In the 18th century, the category of the human was divided into ranks as well, which, of course, with Europeans at the top, and depending upon who they were colonizing at the time, various possible people at the bottom, and then various kinds of animals going down, 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 down till you get to inanimate matter, plants and inanimate matter. So this hierarchical notion, which I think is ingrained in all of us for very good reasons, is essential for the notion of dehumanization, because as soon as we think about the idea of less than human, this doesn't make sense unless we're seeing the world as a hierarchy where there are things lower, entities lower than the human. And so when we dehumanize others, we think, oh, well, yeah, they look human. Sure. But what they really are on the inside, where it matters, is something less than you.
What's interesting about this in terms of white supremacy is that I think a lot of slave owners had slave women raise their children,
Is it
right? So
right?
if you
Yeah.
thought that, black people were subhuman, why would you at the same time want them or allow them to raise your kids? It's got to be one of the most important jobs in the
Yeah,
world.
yeah, yeah.
Parent.
That's right. And I allow them to cook their food. I mean, if I were one of those people, I'd be really scared about what they're putting in it, right? And there were cases of the food being poisoned or spat put in, and so on. So remember, I said that the most toxic forms of dehumanization tend to target males. Males were not put in that role, right? And remember also, I said that during slavery, particularly later, right? So in the early times, we get this explicit dehumanization of enslaved Africans. Once slavery is established in the New World, it tends to be that enslaved people of African descent are lesser humans, but not less than human. And then after the ostensible abolition of slavery, we get dehumanization absolutely with a vengeance, but particularly directed towards males. So if you look at lynching, for instance, at least 97% of the victims were African American males, at least, and probably closer to 100%. So that's part of it. Also, part of it, and this is extremely important. Well, let me give you an example first. This is testimony of a Japanese veteran who took part in the atrocities in China during the war in the Pacific, World War II. And of course, both bodily mutilation and rape was part of these atrocities. Well, this guy said the following. He said, when we raped them, they were women. When we killed them, they were animals. If you look at instances of dehumanization, actual historical instances, what you see is dehumanizers seem to have two contradictory attitudes towards those whom they dehumanize. On the one hand, they characterize them as subhuman. On the other hand, they explicitly or implicitly acknowledge their humanness. So, for instance, what's absolutely typical is that a dehumanized population are accused of being criminal. Find that in the United States with Black people in the late 19th and throughout the 20th century. We find that in the dehumanization of the Rohingya in Myanmar. We find that dehumanization of Jews in Germany and Eastern Europe during the Holocaust. It's just a really common theme. But only human beings can be criminals, right? There are no criminal rats or cockroaches. Also, dehumanized people, dehumanizers often take pains to humiliate humanized people. So, for instance, there was a practice of forcing enslaved Africans to eat out of animal troughs with the dogs. During the Rwanda genocide, one of the practices of militant Hutus was to engage in mass rape of Tutsi women before killing them. And the explicit rationale was to humiliate them, to cut them down to size, to put them in their place as without value. But it's often even explicit that dehumanized people will be described sometimes in the space of a single sentence or a couple of sentences as human and as subhuman. What's going on there? Well, here's what I think is going on. On the one hand, in our encounters with fellow human beings, we can't help regarding them as human. As I said earlier on, it's automatic, it's modular. You particularly looking into a human face, a pair of human eyes. We are just configured to respond in a certain way to that. But on the other hand, we have this input from people in positions of epistemic authority who say, look, don't trust your eyes. These look like humans, sure, but they're not really humans. They are counterfeit. They're beasts in disguise. So what we get then is this incoherent picture of the other, insofar as we're engaged in the dehumanizing project of both human and subhuman, and as dangerous. Remember the other elements, that they're criminal, they're dangerous, they're a threat. So both human and subhuman and dangerous. Now, let me clarify. I don't mean partially human and partially subhuman. This is a radically incoherent state of mind. It's totally human and totally subhuman. Now, some people say, well, yeah, but that's impossible. Yeah, of course it's impossible. Logically speaking, it's impossible. But we are perfectly capable of entertaining dramatic contradictions. That's a feature of human psychology, right? So that explains this kind of flipping back and forth between characterizing the other as human and characterizing the other as subhuman, sort of like a duck-rabbit situation. But there's something more profound and more disturbing about it. There is an academic sub-industry, mini-industry called monster theory. And I found this incredibly useful, particularly the writings of the philosopher Noel Carroll. One of his topics is horror fiction. And one of the questions that he asks in his writings on horror fiction is, well, what's a monster? What's a horrific monster? And his analysis, which for him is totally confined to like horror novels and horror movies, is a monster has to have two characteristics. They have to be physically threatening. They're dangerous. They're not nice. And they have to be what I call, here I abandon his terminology, what I call metaphysically threatening. A monster is sort of an uncanny combination of contradictory kinds of things. You can see this very readily if you consider horror fiction. So to use one of Carroll's favorite examples, think of zombies in zombie movies, right? They're alive and they're dead simultaneously. It's not that part of them, like they have living legs and dead heads. They are totally dead. They're decaying corpses and they're totally alive. They have metabolisms. They walk around. They try to eat your brains. And this gives them this very disturbing quality. They're not just after you. I mean, there are all kinds of dangerous people and things that might be after you. They're not just physically threatening, they're also metaphysically threatening. And this kind of augments the sense of their dangerousness. Or think of a werewolf that's all wolf and all human, right? It's an impossible combination. So if you look at horror fiction, you see this again and again and again. Now, when we come to dehumanization, we have all these ingredients. They're human, and they're less than human, and they're physically threatening. So they're physically threatening and they're metaphysically threatening. And this transforms them into monstrous, demonic beings, embodiments of threat and evil. So in a way, what's going on here, and it's cruelly ironic, really, that it's the very failure of dehumanization, our incapacity to see others simply as less than human animals, because this irritating humanness is always getting in the way, that produces the most horrific and toxic effects of the dehumanizing process. And I know that was rather long-winded, but there are so many elements that needed to be slotted into place there.
No, thank you for that answer. Yeah, there was definitely a lot in your response. So in regards to, I guess, the solution, the remedy to this, social poison, what is it? So the reason why I ask is because, one, I think it's important to kind of combat dehumanization. The second is because I've been thinking about it recently in terms of just how people don't talk to each other, because part of me suspects that the first step of dehumanization is that you just don't think it's productive to even communicate with them because they're so irrational. They're so entrenched in their beliefs, or they're so morally corrupt that there's no point. It's like there's no point talking to a Nazi, right?
You don't negotiate with monsters anyway.
Yes,
right?
Yes, right? And so then what happens is that we just live in our echo chambers, right? And we just hang out with other people who believe exactly like we do, right? And it just exacerbates this problem. It gets to the point where, because everybody I talk to agrees with me, I believe I possess the truth, right? Anybody who doesn't agree with me must be wrong. And they must be evil, because what I believe is right and good and just.
That's right. I agree with all of that.
Okay, so then do you think that the solution is for people to talk to each other?
Well, that's part of it, but unfortunately they can talk to each other in dehumanizing ways. I don't think there's any vaccine for this, but there are steps that can be taken, and those are many. So one step is educational, but not just any old kind of education. Obviously, I mean, the Nazi SS were more highly educated than the average German. The 15 men who sat around the table at Wannsee in early 1942 and decided on the final solution for the so-called Jewish problem, of those, 8 of the 15 had PhDs. They weren't a stupid lot, right? So what kind of education? I think it has to be twofold. One is real historical education. That makes it conceivable that we, whoever we are again, because every group of people has blood on their hands historically, we are capable of doing these things. We have done it in the past. So if we have done it in the past, we're capable of doing it in the future, and maybe we're doing it in the present. We don't recognize it. Another has to do with a sort of psychological education. People need to understand, or it would be very helpful if they did understand, the psychological dispositions that make them vulnerable to the sort of propaganda that leads to dehumanization. And in particular here, what I have in mind is the tendency to essentialize groups. Essentialization is essential to dehumanization, because when we dehumanize others, we admit that their appearance is human, but what they really are, their essence, is something else. So those two are useful. They're certainly not bulletproof. Another domain, sorry, I've got some burn in my eye for some reason, is political. The support of institutions that protect us insofar as we can, an independent judiciary, a free press, freedom of speech. These political moves all can be subverted, right? We just look at Nazis in the early days. I mean, they were always complaining that their freedom of speech was being interfered with. There were posters of Hitler with his mouth taped. This idea of cancelization is not a new one. The Nazis were very disturbed that they were being canceled. And the Nazi case also shows you how quickly protective institutions, from a free press to an independent judiciary and so on, can be subverted. I mean, they moved from a constitutional democracy in Germany to a dictatorship in 3 years. 3 years. But all these things help. Journalists being on the job to call out demonizing rhetoric, that helps. I think one of the things that's really, really important has to do with basic human security. So if you look at the sort of authoritarian propaganda that inculcates dehumanizing attitudes, what it does is it plays on human insecurity. I'm very influenced by a paper that was written it was published in 1941. The author was this remarkable man named Roger Monicarl, who was he had a Ph.D. in philosophy, he had a Ph.D. in anthropology, and he was a practicing psychoanalyst. And in 1932, he went to Germany. He was invited by a friend who was a diplomat to come and listen to Hitler and Goebbels making their stump speeches in the run-up to the 1932 election. And he published this paper on his experience listening to them called The Psychology of Propaganda. And basically what he says is that they made these three moves. They would begin by getting their audience to feel depressed. We're the laughing stock of the world. We've betrayed our great destiny. We've been brought to our knees and humiliated, blah, 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 all doom and gloom. And then, as Monicarl put it, when they're rolling around in an orgy of self-pity, tone changes. Ah, yes, but it's really not your fault. It's the Jews and the communists. They're destroying us from within. They made us lose World War I. We need to stamp them out. They're an existential threat. So it's just a sort of paranoia. And then the punchline is, only I can make Germany great again. Join the party and we will sweep them away and have a 1,000-year Reich and so on and so forth. So we get the offer of salvation. So we got this inculcation of insecurity and the offer of salvation. Now, that worked really well because Germans were objectively insecure in the aftermath of the First World War and the Great Depression. And I think this is true generally. I mean, this process that he described is something that you can very readily observe in authoritarian politicians. When Donald Trump made his first speech announcing that he was throwing his hat into the ring back in 2015, I was listening to it and I thought to myself, if you pardon my language, holy shit, this is exactly the playbook. Now, my well-meaning liberal friends patted me on the head and said, "Oh, silly boy, he's just entertainment." I said, no, you do not get it. This stuff works. And it did work. So the point I'm trying to get to is, if we engineer societies where people are not so objectively insecure, where they have jobs, they have health care, they've got enough to eat, they are protected from crime, then there's less for these demagogues to work with to frighten us and to depress us and then, render us suckers for these promises of salvation.
So the way that you're framing the issue, it sounds like dehumanization is mainly utilized as a tactic by these political leaders or social and cultural leaders to get what they want, right? And some part of it resonates with a particular base, right? So it's not a bottom-up driven phenomenon. It's a top-down.
No. It's a top-down driven. There are people with an investment in getting folks like us to do awful things to other people. We know that. But there's an obstacle in their path. And that's our species-specific ultra-sociality. So human beings are, or I should say Homo sapiens, are massively more sociable than any other mammal. And it's been that way for a very, very long time. We know way back into prehistory, people were engaging in trade, say at long distances, and so on. Now, any social animal has to have inhibitions against doing lethal harm, and also sublethal harm to members of their own community. That's almost an analytic truth, right? So we can't have a community life if we're ripping each other's throats out. In our case, sociology is so marked that it extends beyond the immediate community. In a sense, humanity is one big community for us. And so people then who are trying to get us to do terrible things have got to find ways of overcoming those inhibitions against violence that are elicited simply by the sight of another human face. Now, over the millennia, we have discovered all sorts of ways of engineering human behavior to do this through religious ideologies, through the use of drugs that disinhibit, to the development of long-distance weapons so we don't have to confront the individuals that we're harming. Dehumanization is one of these methods. And so, yes, it is a top-down process, but we need to think properly about what top means, because often, dehumanizing ideologies can be distributed through a community. So I grew up in the Deep South in the 50s and 60s. And, when you have a society where everyone in a position of authority, from parents to teachers to the sheriff to the pastor, these are local epistemic authorities, right? If they all have the same take, of course, you grow up and you live in that sort of environment, of course you're going to take it on. It's entirely rational. It's as rational as avoiding poison ivy because your mother tells you it's dangerous.
Yeah, that makes sense. I kind of want to go back to this, I guess, this process of connecting with another human being, right? Because I almost see it as another way to battle dehumanization. And the reason why it comes to mind is because of this guy named Daryl Davis. This is this black jazz musician who, talked to and befriended multiple Klansmen.
Very cool example.
Yeah. And it's just like, wow, like this is amazing that a person was willing and was able to actually break the stereotypes and dehumanization thought processes that these Klansmen had towards black people, right? Yeah. And like he's talked very openly about this and how they're just extremely racist. They have all these stereotypical essentialist beliefs about black people, how they're less intelligent, how they're inherently violent, right? And but then once they meet me, somebody who's well spoken, once they see that I'm a pretty cool person, then it all just comes crashing down.
Yeah. See, it's easiest to dehumanize people at a distance. Part of the reason why is the greater proximity, the more vigorously our perception of humanity is turned on. I think it behooves us all to try to have conversations with people that have views of us and of others that are what we regard as repellent and dangerous. Now, obviously, that becomes much more difficult and maybe is not even, in many cases, is not to be recommended if you're a possible victim of violence in doing that. So a trans person having a conversation with a violently transphobic person is taking a risk if it's, an in the flesh conversation. But it's certainly something I try to do in interactions online. Because of the work I do, I'm often in contact with people who are white supremacists or anti-Semites or, whatever. And I really do try to have a conversation with them and try to be curious, like what brought you to the views that you have, and try to be oddly enough to be respectful to them. They're human beings. And for all of us, there is some reason why we have the views we have, right? It's not like we just made it up. It's something about our lives has led us to these things, and I'm curious about it. Now, that's rather disarming for people. Now, especially if I'm talking to an anti-Semite and, they know I'm Jewish and they know I have a Jamaican spouse. Both count against me. But if I can engage with them in some kind of a humane way, my hope is that they go away with their views a little bit shaken. But if I try to shame them, that's not going to happen. Now, it's a matter of faith, really, because a lot of what goes on in these interactions is my interlocutor is performing to impress their peers. They're like white supremacist community, and they mustn't lose face in their conversation with me, right? That would disturb their social relations. But I kind of hope that they go away with the seed of doubt planted in them. That's the best one can do. Of course, with some people, having conversations impossible. And they're, well, I just say, I can't have a conversation with you. Maybe we should call it a day here.
Yeah.
But I think insofar as we can, that's helpful.
That makes a lot of sense. I think there is just going to be some people who you really can't talk to, like you just can't, that they're just too entrenched in their beliefs. Yeah. You know, it's interesting. I didn't expect this. Is that because of this conversation, I feel like we should have more sympathy for those who dehumanize. Like we should have a little more sympathy towards the dehumanizers, because they're pawns, they're political pawns that the leaders for their leaders to attain political goals, right?
Yes.
So it's just like they're those political and cultural and social leaders don't really care about their struggles, right? They don't care about them.
Right.
They have their own personal interests to attain.
And thereby but for the grace of God go I, right? We all have the psychological dispositions, which under the right circumstances can lead us to dehumanizing attitudes. We're not clean of those things. And in fact, just one more point relevant to that is there is a big temptation to dehumanize dehumanizers, to describe them as monsters. I mean, let's be straightforward, but there aren't any monsters. Monsters are fictional, and I think that's exactly the wrong approach. We should consider them as holding up a mirror to what we're capable of. And, look, I can say it, I'm Jewish. Hitler wasn't a monster. Hitler was a guy who did really, really bad things and was very, very misguided, but he was not a monster. And there's some story that explains how he got to where he got to. I have sympathy for those who dehumanize. I don't have sympathy for their acts and their attitudes, but I have sympathy for them. And I have a kind of conviction, quixotic though it may sound, that people can change.
Yeah. And in a sense, like the way that you're approaching it, or having respect for the dehumanizer, that actually helps address the issue, right? Because like we mentioned earlier, if you're disrespectful, if you're insulting, right? Yeah. That's just going to make it worse. If you don't acknowledge that people have interests and they're afraid, right? Then you just, you don't acknowledge the humanity in them, right? And then they're going to sense that, and then they're just going to get more entrenched in their beliefs.
And you know what plays into that? The rhetoric of hate and hate speech, right? Because if we say, well, it's just hate, and that's just hate speech, then we're really fundamentally misconceiving the complexity of these phenomena. Just talking about these things in terms of hate really impoverishes our understanding. I mean, just think of this. Slave owners didn't hate their slaves any more than they hated their mule or their plow. That's not what was going on. Contempt, yes. Pity, yes. And then later on, fear. Yes, fear plays a big, big part. This propaganda works largely through fear. So we need a much more sophisticated and humanizing way of understanding these terrible, terrible, and terribly dangerous phenomena. And I think that would really, really help.
One of the things that Daryl Davis says is that he respects his opponent's views, even though, he respects them as a person, even though he doesn't respect their beliefs, right?
Yeah.
And that he believes in the freedom of speech and stuff like that. And I think a lot of it is not only, on principle, but also practical, right? Because if this particular group feels like that they're being silenced, that their voices are not being heard, then I feel like the next step is violence, right? If they don't feel like that they can fight for their interests verbally, they will fight for it physically.
Yeah. I agree with you on that. I don't like labels, but if you're going to label me, I'm a progressive. It's kind of misleading in many respects, but that's would be the best political characterization of me, I think. Now, a lot of the rhetoric that goes on amongst the progressive crowd, shaming and not listening to those that they disapprove of, I think a lot of it is theater. It's demonstrations of righteousness. But look, I think we need to concentrate on what we want to accomplish, right? It can feel really good to try to silence people and shame them and condemn them and insult them. But what is this going to accomplish? Nothing desirable. Now, it doesn't mean the alternative will accomplish anything desirable, but it certainly stands, I think, a better chance than the alternative. So, it's the same with racial discourse. I'm a race skeptic. I don't believe in race. I think of race. I think that race is a toxic fiction, paves the way for and legitimates abuse, and a lot of people who are denouncing racism, in my opinion, are engaging in theater. They're so pure and so good. So let's keep our eyes on the prize.
Yeah, no, thank you for that. I think it's a good place to wrap things up. This is a fascinating discussion and such an important topic. So yeah, again, thank you so much for being here.
Oh, thank you for inviting me. I loved our conversation, and I loved your points and your questions.